I saw quite recently on Twitter a short clip of Jeff Durbin in a conference called the Fight, Laugh, Feast conference, where he dropped some bad words, which has caused some people on social media to comment in a rather disapproving way, and others to respond to those comments in a rather dismissive and can do no wrong sort of way. And, as a matter of fact, the topic of cursing or foul-mouthedness has been interesting to me for quite a while, so I thought, why not? Why not make a short commentary video about this? So, I'm not a very prolific YouTuber, shall we say, because as you might see, my update interval isn't all that frequent, so you don't know anything about me. I'm just a guy, and I talk about stuff, mostly in a language you don't understand. We can leave it at that. I'll just tell you this. I'm Dutch. I've lived practically all my life in Finland. I'm fluent in Finnish and English. I'd be fluent in Dutch too, if I bothered to brush off the rust and broaden my vocabulary. I know a little bit of German as well, and just enough Swedish to pass the requirements of the Finnish school system. So how is this relevant to anything? It's relevant because, as a non-native speaker of any given language, not living in the culture of that language, the curse words and profanities of that language do not have the same impact on me as in my native language. Does that make sense? Hearing somebody curse in English does not have the same impact on me compared to hearing someone curse in Finnish. We have some quite powerful curse words here. Words that invoke the devil, for example. English doesn't have that. Imagine using a word like that as to underline and give emphasis to, say, the size of something. In English, you'd say that something is bleeping huge. If you translate the equivalent expression literally from Finnish to English, you'd get something that is Satan's big. I saw a Satan's huge something. Now, that doesn't even work. It doesn't have any impact. It just sounds weird. We have some very crude references to genitalia, and those are used the same way to underline and add emphasis, or just as plain exclamation, like "oh bleep." That doesn't work in English. In English, however, people are called the names of genitalia to make them more aware of their not so favorable traits. Finnish has that as well, but I've never heard anybody being called the female counterpart. The male appendix, yes. Usually it is a rather crude word that I believe is derived from Russian, and the meaning is pretty much exactly the same as in somebody being called Richard. German is great. In high school, where I studied a bit of German, I learned that a certain curse word, which I obviously already knew, is quite a disapproved one. The word translates literally thunder weather in English. Terrible, isn't it? I was surprised that it is considered such a bad word. I knew the meaning beforehand, of course, because it isn't hard at all to deduce the meaning if you know Dutch and Swedish, which are both Germanic languages. Interestingly enough, I don't know a single curse word in Dutch. Oh wait, I do. Verdraaid! I don't know what it means though. Draaien means to turn, and the ver prefix denotes passivity, that something has turned around by itself. It is like saying, flip. The other one I will not say because I really don't know what it means. It's in the neighborhood of the previous one, very similar, but I can't joke about its etymology, so I will pass. English is funny too, I mean proper English. I just cannot understand, as a non-native speaker, how it can offend anyone to say that something has blood on it. Beats me. So, as you perhaps can see, cursing is very diverse. It is culturally dependent. You might translate a curse word or slur and it loses its impact. It turns from an offensive stab that is meant to cause discomfort to something funny that you can point your finger at, tilt your head backwards, and laugh. Cursing is also very elemental to human nature. Isn't it interesting that when people engage with foreign languages in one way or another, it is the curse words that are among the first ones that are added to one's vocabulary? What's happening here? Why is it like this? What's the motivation? What's the mechanic? How does it all work? It has to do with the fallenness and sinfulness of the human condition. Jesus says in Matthew 15 verse 16, "And he said, Are you also still without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone." Paul in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29 writes, "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear." The Finnish 1938 translation, which is what I mainly read, says that "let no lewd talk come out of your mouth." Also, Paul in the same letter, chapter 5 and verse 4, "Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving." Also, Paul in Colossians 3 verse 8, "But now you must put them all away, anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth." James says in his epistle, chapter 3, verse 6, "The tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among your members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so." This one is especially heartbreaking. I wrote this and I felt like I was about to cry. Am I really like that? This is speaking of people who profess the name of the Lord. It shouldn't be this way. Perhaps you object and say that it isn't that way. Not with me, no. Perhaps you should think again. One reason people use expletives is that they use it to channel emotion of anger and frustration. In its most primitive form, it can burst out as a sort of a groan, like "Ah!" or a deep sigh, like It can also signal amazement, fear, and other emotions. But many times it is let out in form of words. Something I do with my two boys is coming up with funny alternate expletives like "oh, poo on the floor" or "oh, unflushed toilet." They come up with the most funny ones. But I've lately questioned the wisdom of that. Is that really wise? And then again, I don't know what else they do then, because I unwillingly transfer all sorts of bad qualities in myself to them. I can't really help it. So I don't know in what measure exactly it is my bad example and in what measure it is their own fallen nature. Keine Ahnung. I don't know. What is important, though, is to understand what the fallen nature wants to do. It wants to toe the line. It wants to get as close to it without crossing it, so that it can assert its own righteousness and deny any allegations of wrongdoing. In this particular case and example, it always wants to say the worst thing it can. And the can here means what is permissible by cultural standards. My older son has also uttered out loud a bad word. He didn't do it on purpose. He sometimes speaks his own gobbledygook, which is totally fun and fine. And just like that, one time out of his mouth popped a word referring to female genitalia. I couldn't just ignore it, even though he didn't mean anything by it, and even though the word didn't mean anything to him. He might use it in a setting where it will embarrass me and his mother and him as well. If you are concerned about being a good testimony of Christ, that is not a word you want to hear from the mouth of someone you are responsible of, even unintentionally or by accident. But now that I informed my son that this is not acceptable speech, something about him has unreversibly changed. Slowly, piece by piece, the innocence of a child is chipped away. Now he knows, and now that he knows, he might use it. He might say it. In a situation where he really wants to say the worst thing he knows, out of frustration, out of anger, he might just choose that word. When he gets a bit older and has learned to understand a bit more such important personal qualities as self-control, he might choose a different word, a less offensive word. But if there were no restrictions, such as a restrained culture, which is a blessing from God, he would let out the worst thing in his sinful heart. He'd let the monster out. Look, I believe I am a sinner saved by grace. I trust in the finished work of Jesus Christ because I have nothing else to trust. And I see this very thing in myself. I haven't done much English content on YouTube, so it'll take a little effort if you want to listen to it all. There's one occasion where I say the word oxen poo. You know, an ox. Moo. It make a poo. Oxen poo. A synonym for an ox is a bull. A synonym for poo is manure. Did I really have to explain that? You know what I wanted to say. Saying it does not impact me at all. It's a different language, English. It is forever a secondary language to me. It will probably never carry the impact for me that it carries for native speakers, no matter how much I educate myself by telling myself that you should not say this word because the Americans think it is bad. So, why don't I? I know it is going to offend. I know I will not achieve anything by offending. Who wants to listen to a nobody who starts out by spewing profanities? And no, I don't mean offending somebody like in offending with the truth, because truth tends to hurt and anger people who are in denial. They must hear the truth nonetheless. I mean that I deny myself the mischievous satisfaction that I get from saying something totally unnecessary and unhelpful and causing a ruckus. It is like poking an ant hive with a stick and watching them run around. Maybe I was wrong even in saying oxen poo. I wanted to say the proper word. And the want is the problem. From the heart, remember, all sorts of wickedness rises. Who looks with lust has already committed adultery in his heart. Who covets has already stolen in his heart. Who supplants his expletives with more culturally tolerable ones has already said the worst ones he knows in his heart. There is a difference between what a culture deems offensive even though it is true, because the culture hates the truth, and what culture deemed offensive already long before it hated the truth, as much as it does today. I would much rather offend someone the formal way than the latter. The latter really has no justification. There may be a time for hard speech, but it should be harder to make a case for crude and crass talk, because the Bible explicitly condemns that. So why and how are Christians trying to justify this? If you watch the clip where Jeff Durbin says what he says, notice the build-up.
I want to be very careful about what I'm about to do.
I'm gonna say something really offensive now. I do not think that this reflects any confidence in what he wants to say. Quite the opposite, actually. Truth does not need trigger warnings. To me, this was a stunt. Unhelpful. Unnecessary. The justification for this is that we need to be like the prophets. We need to be like the apostles. We need to be like Jesus. Well, Jesus made a whip and hit people with it. Nehemiah says that he punched some of those who had taken foreign wives. I don't know if there are any English translations that carry this over like the Finnish 1938, but it says that he ripped them by their beards. Like took them by the beard and yanked. Why don't you be like the prophets and do that? Should be easy. Lots of voluptuous and voluminous beards all around you to pluck. Some say we should be like Paul, because Paul says skubalon, and that's supposed to be the equivalent of the poo. But that is not the one and only universal interpretation. As I understand, at least from the New Testament perspective, the word is a hapax legomenon. It appears only once. It also appears in the Old Testament apocryphal book, the book of Sirach, the Septuagint version to be precise. The passage is chapter 27, verse 4. As when one sifteth with a sieve the refuse, skubala, remaineth, so the filth of man in his talk. Clearly, the picture is not about sifting something which leaves behind the poo, but rather rubbish or chaff. Funny how this text speaks about the filth of man's talk. There's some appropriate wisdom here, and this isn't even scripture. Can God reprove you through the wisdom of Sirach? Think about it. You know, I know my own motivations, or at least I think I do, and to me, this notion that Paul really used a really bad word was such that it gave me license and opportunity to say, so I can say that word too? You mean Paul said so I can say too? Whee! So I gave myself the permission. But my motivation was wrong. There's this classic tale of a young dating couple coming to ask the spiritual counselor that question, which is basically, how close can we get to sinning without actually sinning? And the informed answer is of course, that's the wrong question. As far away as possible. Flee sin, flee immorality, pursue holiness. How and why does it not apply here? Another justification in Durbin's sermon clip was this reference to Ezekiel. He read some of good old Eek here, but he didn't even read the best stuff. Because it gets downright graphical, and I mean pornographical. And that is not supposed to be funny. As a matter of fact, why don't I just read those passages aloud here? What would be my motivation? Look, what God says, I can say the same. I've got permission. Even though whatever God does and says is from a pure and holy motivation, and nothing I do can ever be. I'm not saying don't ever deal with that text in a sermon or Bible study or whatever, but what I'm saying is understand why you do it. I believe it should feel like a duty rather than an opportunity. Think about it. If you can avoid saying profane things, why don't you? Jeff Durbin didn't have to say what he said. He wanted to. This is God speaking about the people, and he uses the picture of an unfaithful wife. So we should be bold to speak the same way. I respectfully disagree. I thought that Jeff Durbin, out of all the people I've listened to on the internet along the years, would be one to understand the difference between the unfaithful wives of Yahweh in the Old Testament, which he both divorced, and the bride of Christ, or as I would say, the wife of Christ. Jeff is, after all, a preterist, as am I. Paul Washer has this legendary sermon, which you have probably all seen and listened to, which is called 10 Indictments Against the Modern Church in America. Listen to it. He gets really angry, multiple times raises his voice, uses hard words too, doesn't pull punches, doesn't mince words. That sermon does not need a single curse word to pack a punch. I can't listen to it without getting a lump in my throat. I'm not saying you need to be like Paul Washer. I don't like it when people set unbiblical standards on how passionate the output of a preacher needs to be. But if you sound silly trying to imitate the passion of Paul Washer, please, no number of expletives will help. Stop! In that sermon, Paul Washer said something that has stuck with me ever since.
I hear theologians, itinerant teachers, pastors, this and that, saying these sorts of things. There's just as much sin in the church as out of the church. There's just as much divorce in the church as out of the church. There's just as much immorality and pornography in the church as out of the church. And then preachers saying, yes, the church is acting like a whore. I want you to know this. You ought to be very careful calling the bride of Jesus Christ a whore. I'll tell you what the problem is. Pastors and preachers don't know what the church is. I want you to know that the Church of Jesus Christ in America is beautiful. She is frail at times. She is weak. She is buffeted. She is not perfect. But I want you to know she is broken. She is humbly, and she is humbly walking with her God. The problem is you don't know what the church is. Today, because of the lack of biblical preaching, the so-called church is filled up with carnal, wicked people identified with Christianity. And then because of all the goats in the midst of the lambs are blamed for all the things the goats are doing. And then the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of us.
Christ loves his wife. He has sanctified her. There is no spot and no blemish. Those who go after other gods are not her. How can you use such language when there's nobody to use that language of? The church is the true Israel. The true Israel will never go whoring after the gods of cultural Marxism, BLM, social justice, climate change, COVID panic. I saw someone comment on Twitter that they are not willing to give culture that authority, like in determining what is acceptable to say and what isn't. All I can say to that is that there is a culture war going on. The culture that opposes this potty mouth business happens to be the last vestige of the Christian culture. is the very culture I thought that post-meal was supposed to be cultivating. This is not honoring your father and mother who taught you better manners. And at the same time, while the other side has their list of offensive words and restrictive speech codes, they are the ones going F this and F that. So that is how low we need to go? No thanks. And if no culture nowhere is such that it can be a reference point to what the Bible might require of us in our own milieu regarding the manner in which Christians should speak, how is it not totally arbitrary then? What would you think of a new Bible translation? Instead of he lay with her, it said he her. Why not? I did some research. These wonderful four-letter words we all know and love are the original Anglo-Saxon words. Isn't that interesting? They were not considered bad words, but they became vulgar when the French invaded and brought their more sophisticated words with them. I repeat what I said earlier. The want is the problem. What do you want to do? Do you want to rub against the culture with truth? Or do you want to rub against the culture with bad behavior and make excuses for it? Your choice. Just know that whichever you choose, you also choose with it the culture you are rubbing against. So what's the remedy here? My motivations are never pure enough. I cannot in good conscience say that trying to shock somebody with vulgar language is a particularly holy endeavor. I did not want to pursue holiness with my speech. I was looking for validation for something that is not holy. I'm sorry. I want my speech to be truthful, edifying, helpful, and holy. May the Lord help me in that. But I rest in the fact that in all my falling short of the glory of God there is the righteousness of Jesus Christ, in which I have been clothed. Just one more thing. There's this proverb or saying, you have probably heard it. It says, "It is better to light a candle than curse the darkness." It has been attributed to Confucius or as an old Chinese proverb and some others. Well, color me surprised when I found this article by a site called Quote Investigator. Let me read to you. Listen. The earliest appearance located by Quote Investigator occurred in a 1907 collection titled The Supreme Conquest and Other Sermons Preached in America by William L. Watkinson. A sermon titled The Invincible Strategy downplayed the value of verbal attacks or undesirable behaviors and championed the importance of performing good works. In September 1907, Watkinson's sermon, The Invincible Strategy, was reprinted in a periodical called China's Millions, which was published by a Protestant Christian missionary society based in China. William A. Watkinson was a Wesleyan preacher, and by the little information I was able to gather about him, he is characterized as a man of rich and carefully thought out verbal output. It seems to me that his yes was a yes, and his no was a no. It's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. I hope you can say an amen to that. Lens flare! Woohoo!